Johnson County, Wyoming, January 10th, 1903. The thermometer nailed to the outside wall of the Halverson cabin read 47 degrees below zero. Not 47 degrees cold. 47 degrees below the point where water stopped being water. 47 degrees below the place where the wind stopped being wind and became something else entirely. Something that had no name in any language Sigrid Halverson had ever learned, something that simply took and took and took until there was nothing left to take. She knew the number without looking. She had been watching that thermometer for 5 years, learning its moods the way a sailor learns the sea, not with affection, but with the particular respect one reserves for things that can kill you without effort. 47 below meant the water in the wash basin inside the cabin, 3 feet from a burning stove, would freeze before morning. It meant that a man who stepped outside without preparation, who underestimated by even 1 layer of wool, who paused 1 second too long in the wrong place, could lose fingers before he understood what was happening. Sigrid knew all of this. She also knew something that no one else in Johnson County knew on that particular morning. 8 feet below the ground, where she stood beneath the frozen crust of Wyoming prairie that had defeated stronger men than any in this valley, the temperature was 53 degrees. It had been 53 degrees yesterday. It had been 53 degrees in August when the surface baked at 90. It would be 53 degrees in March when the thaw came creeping back across the plains. The earth did not care about January. The earth did not know what January was. Sigrid Halverson had slept there the night before. She had slept without a fire, without extra blankets, without waking once to feed a stove or check a thermometer. She had slept the way she had not slept in 5 years of Wyoming winters, the deep and certain sleep of a person who is not afraid. Above her, 8 feet up, through layers of clay and gravel, in the cold dead roots of prairie grass, the world was trying to kill everything it touched. She had known it would work. She had known for a very long time. This is her story, not the story of a lucky guess or a stubborn woman who happened to be right. The story of knowledge that was carried across an ocean in the mind of a person nobody thought to ask, knowledge that waited patiently through 4 years of brutal Wyoming winters until the right moment arrived, until necessity stripped away every other option, until there was nothing left between Sigrid Halverson and the hole in the ground that would save her family's life. To understand what she built, you have to understand where she came from. And to understand where she came from, you have to go back further than Wyoming. You have to go back to the dark and the deep and the particular cold of a Finnish winter that has been teaching people how to survive since long before anyone thought to write down the lesson. Österbothnia, Finland, 1876. Sigrid was 12 years old the first time her father took her underground. His name was Olavi Virtanen, and he was a copper miner by trade and a teacher by instinct, a man who believed that knowledge belonged to the person who could use it, not to the person who happened to be born into the right circumstances to receive it. He had 3 daughters and no sons, and he refused to let that accident of biology determine what his children would understand about the world. When Sigrid was old enough to carry a lantern without dropping it, he took her down. The shaft dropped 50 feet into the Finnish bedrock. Sigrid remembered the way the temperature changed as they descended, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a smooth and certain progression, the surface cold giving way to something steadier, something that had no interest in the weather above. By the time they reached the working level, the air was cool but stable, not warm by any standard a person above ground would recognize, but constant, reliable, alive in its own strange way. Her father placed her hand against the rock wall. He said nothing for a moment. He let her feel it. The earth does not change, he told her finally in Finnish, in the particular way he had of stating facts as though they were gifts. The seasons are something that happens on the surface. Down here, it is always the same. Do you understand what that means? Sigrid was 12 years old, and she was pressing her palm against Finnish bedrock 50 feet below a January blizzard, and she understood exactly what it meant. It meant the earth was keeping a secret. It meant that all the suffering above, all the fuel burned and the sleep lost, and the fingers blackened by frost was happening in a layer of the world so thin that you could escape it simply by going down. "How do you use it?" she asked. Her father smiled. He had been waiting for that question. The underground barracks at the mine were not comfortable by any definition a person of the 21st century would recognize. They were rough timber structures built into the rock at a depth where the temperature held steady regardless of the surface conditions. The men who worked the winter shifts slept there rather than climbing to the surface each night and risking the journey back in temperatures that could drop to -30 before dawn. The barracks were not heated. There was no stove, no fireplace, nothing that burned. The earth provided what was needed 52 degrees constant, impatient, and the men's own bodies provided the rest. Sigrid visited those barracks 4 times before her father decided she understood enough to ask the next question. On the 4th visit, she asked it herself. Why don't people build houses like this? Her father sat down on a rough timber bench and looked at her for a long moment. He was a man of medium height with large hands and a quiet face that showed things slowly the way ice thaws in almost imperceptible stages. Because he said, people do not think about what the ground knows. They think about what they know. And what they know is that houses go above the ground because that is where houses have always gone. But if they knew about the temperature, Sigrid said. If they knew, her father agreed. But who teaches them the ground does not send letters? She was 16 when he built the sleeping chamber. The winter of 1880 had been the worst in the memory of everyone living in the Virtanen family's village, a sustained cold that came in early November and did not release its grip until April's 7 months of temperatures that made ordinary life into an act of survival. The family's house above ground was adequate for normal winters. For this one, it was barely enough. Sigrid's youngest sister developed a cough in December that settled into her chest and refused to leave. Her mother burned through their fuel supply 3 weeks earlier than expected and had to beg supplemental wood from neighbors who could barely spare it. Olavi watched his family suffer through the first 3 months of that winter and made a decision. He began digging in March when the surface frost had loosened enough to work, choosing a rise of ground behind the house where the drainage was good and the soil ran sandy above a gravel layer that would carry water away. The excavation took 6 weeks. He worked alone on most days, coming home in the evenings with dirt on his hands and a careful expression on his face that Sigrid recognized as the look he wore when he was solving a problem in his head while his hands did something else. The chamber he built was small, 8 feet by 10, with timber walls and a ceiling of heavy beams topped with 2 feet of packed earth. A narrow passage connected it to the root cellar of the house, allowing access without going outside. A ventilation pipe rose from the ceiling to the surface, drawing fresh air through the passage and exhausting stale air upward through the natural temperature differential. Sigrid helped him build the ceiling. She helped him pack the earth above it. She was 16 years old and she was learning something that most of the world would not understand for another century. Something about the relationship between depth and temperature, between the mass of the earth and the chaos of the seasons, between what can be controlled and what can simply be accepted. They slept in the chamber that winter and the winter after, and the winter after that. Sigrid measured the temperature every morning and every evening, writing the numbers in a small notebook her father gave her specifically for that purpose. The notebook had a red cover and smelled of pine resin. The numbers inside it never varied by more than 3 degrees across the entire year. Surface temperatures swung from 90 above in summer to 40 below in winter, a range of 130 degrees. Below ground, the range was 3. She carried that notebook in her memory for the rest of her life. But there is something else you need to know about those years in Finland, something that comes before the chamber and the measurements in the inherited knowledge. Something that explains why Sigrid understood what she understood and why understanding it was not enough, not for a long time. In the autumn of 1886, when Sigrid was 22 years old and newly married to Arvid Halvorsen, a young miner from a neighboring village, her father's employer announced that the northern copper deposits were played out and the operation was relocating to a different region 60 miles east where new seams had been discovered. The miners and their families were offered the chance to relocate with the company. Most of them went. Olavi Virtanen went with them. He left behind the house with the underground chamber, left behind the village, and the familiar cold and the particular quality of Finnish winter light that Sigrid had known her entire life. The new location was a raw camp in the forest, hastily built without the infrastructure that had accumulated over 20 years at the old site. There was no time to build a sleeping chamber before winter came. There was barely time to build walls. The winter of 1886 in the new camp was not as severe as the winter of 1880 had been. It did not need to be. Olavi Virtanen was 61 years old, and he had spent 40 years underground and above it in the particular way of Finnish miners, which is to say he had spent 40 years at the margins of survival, burning through the resilience that the body accumulates in youth and spends in age. The cold that would have been manageable at 40 was not manageable at 61. He developed pneumonia in December. He died in February, 3 weeks before the spring thaw would have given him back the ground he needed to dig. Sigrid received the news by letter. She was in her husband's village, pregnant with their first child, reading words that told her that the man who had given her the most important knowledge she possessed was gone, and that he had died precisely because there was no underground chamber in the new camp, no depth to retreat to, no earth memory to substitute for the fuel they could not afford to buy. She kept the letter for the rest of her life. She kept it in the same drawer as the red notebook with the temperature measurements. In 1898, Sigrid and Arvid Halvorsen sold what they owned in Finland and bought passage to America. They were 34 and 37 years old, respectively, old enough to know what they were leaving and young enough to believe in what they were going toward. The American West was promising land and independence and the particular dignity that comes from owning something. What it delivered in the high plains of northern Wyoming was wind that stopped for no reason except its own eventual exhaustion grass that ran to every horizon under a sky so large it made a person feel like a mistake in winters. The winters. Sigrid's first Wyoming winter, 1899, introduced her to a cold she had not encountered in Finland, not because the temperatures were more extreme, though they were, but because of the wind. Finnish cold was a weight that pressed down. Wyoming cold was a force that moved, that found every gap and weakness in every structure, that turned a wall from a barrier into a sieve. She burned through twice the firewood she had planned for. She woke 3 times each night to feed the stove. She watched Arvid's face in the firelight and saw something in it she had not seen before. The particular tightening around the eyes that means a person is calculating how much further they have to go before it is over. She thought about the underground chamber every day of that first winter. She thought about it the way you think about a tool that is locked in a box somewhere that you cannot reach. She did not say anything, not because she was shy and not because she doubted herself. She did not say anything because she had been in Wyoming for 4 months and she had learned something about this particular world, about how it organized knowledge and who it listened to when knowledge was offered. She had watched men dismiss things they did not understand and then return to the same things 3 months later, after their own curiosity led them there, as though the idea had never existed before they thought of it. She had watched women make suggestions that drifted off into silence, and then watched the same suggestions reappear in the mouths of men and be received with the weight of new discovery. She was not bitter about this. She was practical about it. There is a difference. She waited. By 1901, Arvid had been thinking about the same problem for 2 winters. He was a miner by training and instinct, a man who thought in terms of what the earth contained and what could be extracted from it. And the problem of winter heat was beginning to present itself to him in those terms. He had worked underground long enough to know the temperature held steady at depth. He had slept in Finnish mining barracks and experienced firsthand what that steadiness meant at 3 in the morning when the surface world was trying to kill the livestock. He was arriving by his own road at the same destination Sigrid had reached in 1876. One evening in January 1901, he described the idea to her, not with confidence, but with the tentative quality of a man testing a thought against the air to see if it would hold. An underground sleeping chamber, 8 feet down, timbers for walls, a passage from the cabin. The earth would hold the temperature at around 50 degrees, he thought, maybe a bit more. It would be enough to sleep without fire. Sigrid listened to every word. When he finished, she stood up, went to the drawer where she kept important papers, and came back to the table with the red notebook. She opened it to the first page. 42 months of temperature measurements morning and evening from the chamber her father had built in 1880. The numbers ran in careful columns down pages that had grown soft with age, that still faintly smelled of pine resin from the drawer in Finland, where she had kept them for years before packing them for America. She placed the notebook on the table in front of Arvid. She did not say anything. She let the numbers speak. Arvid looked at the pages for a long time. He turned them slowly, reading the columns, doing the arithmetic in his head, understanding what the data meant in the particular way of a man who has lived close to cold long enough to feel the implications in his body rather than just his mind. When he looked up, his expression had changed. "You've been measuring this since 1880, he said. "Since I was 16, she said. "Your father's chamber." "He built it. I measured it." Arvid was quiet for another moment. Then, "You've known this could work since before we came to America." "I've known it could work since before I knew you," she said. There was a long silence in the cabin, the kind of silence that contains more conversation than most conversations do. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the Wyoming wind ran its nightly inventory of everything it intended to destroy. "Why didn't you say so earlier?" Arvid asked. Sigrid looked at him steadily. "You didn't ask," she said. He nodded slowly. There was no defensiveness in the gesture, no argument. Just acknowledgement, the clean acknowledgement of a man confronting something true. "I'm asking now," he said. "That was the beginning." They spent the winter of 1901 planning, which in practice meant Sigrid explaining, in Arvid listening, which was a reversal of the usual order of things in their household, and in the wider world of Johnson County, Wyoming, in which Arvid accepted without complaint, because he was a man who was more interested in being warm than in being right. Sigrid drew the diagrams. She calculated the depth required based on her father's measurements and what she had learned about Wyoming's average annual temperature, which was lower than Finland's by several degrees, meaning the stable zone would be slightly cooler, perhaps 52 to 54 degrees, rather than the 55 she had measured at home. Still sufficient, still far above the killing cold above. She specified the timber dimensions, the spacing of the shoring, the slope of the tunnel floor required to drain water toward the sump. She described the ventilation pipe and explained the physics behind it. The temperature differential between the chamber and the outside air would create a natural convection, pulling fresh air through the tunnel and exhausting stale air upward without any mechanical assistance. She had watched this work for 3 years in her father's chamber. Arvid contributed something Sigrid valued greatly, which was the ability to translate design into the specific conditions of their property. He knew the land. He knew where the gravel layer ran beneath the clay, where the drainage was reliable, where the ground rose enough above the surrounding terrain to keep the spring melt from pooling. He walked the property and came back with a location, a slight rise 30 feet behind the cabin, east-facing, with the right combination of soil composition and elevation. The site selection was right. Sigrid tested it herself, digging a pilot hole 3 feet deep and watching it through 2 rainstorms. The water disappeared within hours. The gravel was doing its work. They planned to begin in May 1902, when the ground thawed deep enough to work without breaking equipment. Arvid would do the main excavation. Sigrid would manage the shoring and the drainage. They had told no one, partly because neither of them wanted to spend winter entertaining objections, and partly because Sigrid had learned that ideas announced before they were built had a way of being talked to death before they could prove themselves. But Wyoming is not a place that keeps secrets well. It is too flat, too open, too populated by people who have nothing between themselves and the horizon except the space to notice everything that happens. By early spring, the neighbors knew something was planned. They did not know what. They knew that Arvid Halverson had been measuring a piece of ground behind his cabin with rope and stakes, which was the kind of thing that men did when they were building something. The speculation at the general store in Buffalo ran variously toward a new root cellar, an expanded barn foundation, and in the view of one particularly imaginative rancher, a cistern for rainwater collection. Garrett Wycliffe rode over in April. He was 52 years old, a man who had been running cattle in Johnson County since 1884, which in the particular arithmetic of frontier experience meant he considered himself an authority on what worked and what didn't in this specific piece of the world. He had a rancher's face creased deep by 18 years of Wyoming sun and wind, and a rancher's directness that could read as either honesty or rudeness, depending on the occasion. He found Arvid driving survey stakes and introduced himself with the assumption of a man who already knew everyone worth knowing. "Planning something?" he asked, looking at the stakes. "A sleeping chamber," Arvid said. "Underground, 8 feet down." Wycliffe looked at the stakes, then at the cabin, then back at Arvid. "For sleeping," he said. "Connected to the cabin by a tunnel. The Earth holds steady temperature at that depth regardless of surface weather. We sleep down there in winter. No fire needed." Wycliffe was quiet for a moment, in the particular way of a man running rapid calculations about whether the person he is talking to is eccentric, delusional, or possibly dangerous. "You're going to sleep in a hole," he said finally. "In a chamber," Arvid said. "In the ground, 8 feet down." Wycliffe looked at the sky, which was the pale blue of early Wyoming spring, which is to say, beautiful and indifferent. "I've been ranching this territory for 18 years, he said. "Underground is where we put things we want to stay cold. Meat, milk." He paused. "The dead." "In Finland," Arvid said, "underground is where miners sleep warm without fire." "This isn't Finland," Wycliffe said. "No," Arvid agreed. "It's colder." Wycliffe rode away without saying goodbye. What he would never know, because he never asked, was that the woman watching from the cabin window had been thinking about this for 22 years. Sigrid had watched the conversation from across the yard, far enough away to appear to be attending to other business close enough to read the shape of it without hearing the words. She recognized the geometry of it, the way Wycliffe had positioned himself, the tilt of his hat, the direction his horse was pointed, even before he finished speaking. She had watched that geometry play out in different settings across her entire life. A man with inherited authority informing a man with actual knowledge that the knowledge was insufficient. The particular patience required to watch this and say nothing. She had been practicing that patience since she was 12 years old. She went inside and checked the thermometer she had hung in the root cellar, the highest point of the underground system she was planning. It read 48 degrees, already 8 degrees warmer than the surface air on this mild spring day. By summer, the gap would reverse. By winter, it would become the difference between comfort and catastrophe. The digging began in May. The topsoil came easy, 18 inches of prairie loam that had been building since the last ice age, dark and loose and cooperative. Below that, the clay began. Arvid worked alone for the first weeks, descending each morning with a pickaxe and shovel and the rope and pulley system he had rigged to haul earth to the surface in buckets. Sigrid managed the surface operation, emptying the buckets and distributing the excavated soil across the low area near the creek where they needed fill. She kept the notebook updated, recording the depth each day and the temperature at the bottom of the excavation each morning. By mid-June, the hole was 4 feet deep, and the temperature at the bottom was already reading 4 degrees warmer than the surface air. This was the first proof, not proof to anyone else. Proof to herself of what she already knew, the numbers confirming what her father's notebook had told her, and what her own 3 years of measurement had reinforced. The Earth was keeping its promise. The depth was working. On July 14, 1902, Arvid Halvorsen coughed blood into his handkerchief for the first time. He said nothing about it that evening. Sigrid saw the handkerchief in his coat pocket when she was doing the washing. She did not say anything either. Some things need a day to become real. By July 20th, the cough had deepened into something that had weight to it, a sound that seemed to come from further inside the chest than a normal cough that persisted through the night and left Arvid pale and depleted in the mornings. The hole was 5 feet deep, 3 feet short of the target. Dr. Harlan Price rode out from Buffalo on July 23rd. A compact man in his 40s who had the particular quality of frontier physicians, which was an ability to deliver difficult news without euphemism, because euphemism cost time that people in remote places did not have. Pneumonia, he said after the examination. Early stages. If you rest completely, no heavy labor, no cold exposure, you'll likely recover. If you push it, you risk advancing to the stage where I can't help you. He paused. No digging, he added with a look at Arvid that included Sigrid in its scope. I understand you have a project. The project waits. Arvid looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at Sigrid. Then he looked at the ceiling again. For how long, he asked. Until spring at the earliest, Price said. Possibly longer. The doctor rode away. Arvid sat on the edge of the bed, and the silence in the cabin had a different quality than the silences before, heavier, with more inside it. The chamber, he started. I'll finish it, Sigrid said. He looked at her. The shoring alone at that depth, the timbers are heavy and the technique at the corners requires. I know the technique, she said. I watched you do it for 7 weeks. I've been thinking about the corners since February. Another silence. Outside, the Wyoming summer wind moved across the grass in long, slow waves. The community will talk, Arvid said. The community is already talking, Sigrid said. They were talking before we started. Let them talk about something real. The next morning, before the community had finished its coffee, Sigrid Halvorsen descended into the 5-foot excavation behind her cabin with a pickaxe and a shovel and the particular quality of purpose that comes from waiting 22 years to do something you already know how to do. Garrett Wycliffe saw her. He was riding the fence line between his property and the Halvorsen land, a routine he performed 3 times a week, and he pulled up his horse at the rise that gave him a clear view of the Halvorsen property. And he sat there for a full minute, watching the woman in the hole before he rode to the cabin door. Arvid answered in his coat, pale, clearly unwell. Your wife is in the hole, Wycliffe said. I know, Arvid said. With a pickaxe. She knows what she's doing, Arvid said. Wycliffe looked past him toward the excavation site. The sound of the pickaxe came steady across the morning air, unhurried, methodical, the rhythm of someone who has done this before. A woman digging an underground chamber, he said, as though testing the sentence to see if it made more sense spoken aloud. It did not. A woman who grew up in Finnish copper mines, Arvid said, who has been thinking about this particular project for longer than either of us has been in Wyoming. Wycliffe shifted in his saddle. Get her to stop, he said. She's making the whole county look. No, Arvid said simply. Wycliffe's expression changed. It was the first time in their acquaintance that Arvid Halvorsen had said no to him without qualification, without the softening of a second sentence, and the directness of it landed differently than expected. I beg your pardon? She knows what she's doing better than I do, Arvid said. I won't tell her to stop. Wycliffe sat with this for a moment, then he rode away. That evening he told his wife what he had seen. His wife, a woman named Clara, who had been observing Sigrid Halvorsen since the Halvorsens arrived in Johnson County 4 years ago, with the particular attention that frontier women paid to each other, because their survival often depended on understanding other women, accurately listened to the account and said, what exactly is wrong with what she's doing? Wycliffe did not have an immediate answer. He had opinions about it, which was different. The news spread through the community with the efficiency of a high plains wind. By the end of July, every rancher and homesteader within 20 miles of the Halvorsen property knew that Sigrid Halvorsen was alone in a hole in the ground, digging 8 feet down into the Wyoming earth, while her husband lay sick in the cabin above. Thaddeus Breck rode over on a Wednesday morning, not to offer help, which might have implied approval, but to observe with his own eyes what he had been told was happening. He was a practical man with practical concerns. Spring's going to fill that hole like a stock pond, he told Sigrid from the edge of the excavation. She did not stop working. Gravel layer below the clay, she said. Water drains. The pilot hole stayed dry through 3 inches of rain last month. Breck looked at the earth walls. At the shoring already in place, the tight timber joints, the careful angling at the corners. Where'd you learn to shore like that? My father's mine, Sigrid said. In 7 weeks watching my husband. Breck was quiet for a moment. What about spring melt? The site is on high ground. The sump in the corner will catch anything the gravel doesn't take. Same principle as a mine drainage system. She paused in her work and looked up at him. Do you have other concerns, or shall I get back to work? He got back on his horse. He was not angry. He was for the first time paying attention to something he had been looking at for several weeks without seeing. Pastor Elias Engstrom came on a Thursday. He was a spare man with careful hands who had been tending to the spiritual needs of Johnson County's Lutheran community for 11 years. And he had the quality of good pastors, which is that he asked more questions than he answered. He found Sigrid at the surface that morning sorting timber for the next ring of shoring. The congregation is concerned, he said, which was his way of saying he was concerned, which was his way of saying he was interested. They were concerned in June too, Sigrid said. They have not visited to ask what I'm actually doing. I'm asking, he said. She handed him the notebook, not the red finished notebook, but the current one, the Wyoming notebook she had begun in May. He turned pages. Temperature readings, soil composition notes, drainage observations, timber load calculations. His expression shifted as he read the way expressions shift when they encounter something organized and purposeful in a place where they expected something impulsive and eccentric. You've been planning this for some time, he said. 22 years, she said. He looked up. She told him about Finland, about her father, about the 3 winters of temperature measurements in the red notebook, about the winter of 1886 in the camp in the forest, in the absence of a chamber, in what that absence had cost. When she finished, Pastor Engstrom was quiet for a long moment. I'll pray your engineering matches your confidence, he said finally. Pray for those burning 10 cords a winter, Sigrid said. They need it more than I do. The shoring deepened through August. The timbers went in at the corners first, then the horizontal planking between them, creating the timber box that would hold back the earth's pressure at full depth. Sigrid had watched Arvid do this at the shallower levels and understood the technique. What she discovered working alone at depth was that understanding the technique and executing it in the particular conditions of this specific excavation were different skills, and that the second skill was built from the first, only through the accumulation of mistakes small enough to correct before they became disasters. She made 3 such mistakes and corrected all 3. The first was a corner joint at 6 feet that showed movement within a day of installation, a slight but perceptible shift in the vertical timber that she caught by touching it and feeling the vibration when she struck the adjacent wall. She reset the joint, added a diagonal brace, checked the opposing corner for the same tendency. It was there. She corrected it. The second was a section of wall at 7 feet where she had underestimated the clay's water content, which was higher than the soil above it, which meant the pressure on the shoring was higher than she had calculated for. She doubled the planking thickness across that section, cutting new timber and fitting it in the confined space of the excavation, which required a specific kind of physical patience that she had, which was the patience of someone who has been working in small spaces since she was 12 years old. The third mistake was the placement of the ventilation pipe, which she had initially positioned too close to the prevailing wind direction, which would have created an irregular draft rather than the steady convection the system required. She recalculated and repositioned. Arvid watched from the cabin window when he was well enough to sit up. He could see the excavation site from the east window, and on the days when the morning light was right, he could see the top of Sigrid's head as she worked at the surface level, sorting material or planning the next stage. On the days when she was below ground, there was only the sound of the pickaxe and the steady appearance of earth in the bucket at the top of the rope. He did not offer advice unless she asked. She asked twice. Both times he answered and did not elaborate. She had not needed elaboration since 1880, and she did not need it now. The excavation reached full depth in late August. 8 feet below the Wyoming prairie, Sigrid stood on the gravel floor she had prepared and pressed her palm against the earth wall that was not yet timbered, the raw soil that had been at this depth since before there was anyone in this valley to give it a name. It was cool against her hand, steady, exactly as she had known it would be. She thought of her father, of the mine shaft in Finland and the large hands that had guided her 12-year-old palm against the rock and said the earth does not change. Of the red notebook, of the winter of 1886 and the letter that arrived and what it had cost. Of 4 years of Wyoming winters burning through firewood and losing sleep and watching Arvid's face in the firelight, doing calculations about survival. She didn't cry. She pressed her palm against the earth wall and she made a note in the notebook. Depth 8 feet. Wall temperature 54 degrees Fahrenheit. September 1st, 1902. Then she went back to work. The ceiling was the most important element, and Sigrid knew it. Heavy beams spanning the full width of the chamber, cut from the salvaged pine she had sourced from an abandoned mining works 20 miles distant, the same heavy timber that had proven itself underground and would prove itself again. Above the beams, planking. Above the planking, 2 feet of packed earth, the full thermal seal that would complete the insulation and carry the ground temperature down to the chamber walls. She built it over 3 days in early September, working with the particular care of someone who understands that the ceiling above their sleeping space carries the consequences of every decision made during its construction. Each beam was measured twice. Each joint was checked. The earth packing above was done in layers, each layer tamped firmly before the next was added, ensuring the density that would hold the temperature and not shift under frost pressure. When the last layer of earth was in place, Sigrid went down into the chamber and stood in the finished space for the first time. 8 by 10 feet, 7-foot ceiling, timber walls, earthen floor covered with salvaged planking, the ventilation pipe rising from the corner to the surface, the tunnel opening at the far end connecting back to the root cellar of the cabin. The thermometer she had mounted on the wall read 54 degrees. Above her, the late summer air was 78 degrees. In 4 months, that reading would represent the warmest place in Johnson County. She went to find Arvid. He was sitting at the table, recovered enough to be restless, but not yet recovered enough to work. He looked at her when she came in at the dirt on her hands and her clothes at her face that showed something he had not seen in it for several months, which was the specific expression of completion that comes when a long project reaches the end it was always headed toward. "Come and see," she said. He put on his coat and followed her across the yard and through the tunnel passage and emerged into the chamber. He looked at the walls, at the ceiling, at the thermometer. He walked to the far wall and placed his hand against the timber, feeling the steadiness in it, the complete indifference to the world above. He stood there for a moment with his hand against the wood, the temperature her father had promised. Constant, patient, exactly as described. He looked at his wife. She was standing near the entrance, watching him, the notebook in her hand. "You did it," he said. Sigrid looked at the thermometer. Then she opened the notebook and wrote the date in the temperature and closed it again. "My father did it first," she said. "I just remembered." The first night Sigrid slept underground alone, Arvid did not sleep at all. He lay in the cabin bed listening to the stove work against the November cold and counted the hours. The surface temperature had dropped to 19 degrees by the time darkness settled over the Johnson County prairie, and the wind had found the gap between the cabin's north wall and the foundation that Arvid had been meaning to pack with mud since October, and had not gotten to, and through that gap came a cold that was not a draft, but a presence, something with intention, something that knew where the warmth was and moved toward it with patience. He fed the stove at 10 o'clock. He fed it again at midnight. At 2 in the morning, he sat up and calculated in the way he had been calculating every winter night for 5 years. How much wood remained in the pile outside? How many nights of cold remained between now and April? Whether the arithmetic was going to work out. It usually worked out. It had not one winter in 3 worked out comfortably. 8 feet below the ground where he lay making these calculations, the temperature was 53 degrees. He knew this because Sigrid had told him, because the thermometer confirmed it, because the physics were not complicated once you understood them. He knew it in his mind. But knowing a thing in your mind and trusting it in the dark at 2 in the morning are different operations. And the second one had not yet been fully installed in Arvid Halverson's nervous system. At 5 in the morning, he gave up on sleep and built the fire higher than necessary and made coffee and sat at the table and waited. Sigrid emerged from the tunnel entrance in the root cellar at 5:45. She climbed the stairs into the kitchen, looked at her husband's face, looked at the fire burning at a height that the morning temperature did not require, and sat down across from him. 53 degrees, she said. All night. I woke once, not from cold. I woke because it was quiet. Arvid looked at the fire. I fed the stove 3 times. I know, she said. I couldn't not. I know, she said again. He looked at his hands around the coffee cup. How quiet. Sigrid considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. You know the sound this cabin makes at 2 in the morning? She said. The stove ticking, the wind finding the north wall, the way the roof timbers shift when the temperature drops fast. He nodded. None of that, she said. Just the earth, which makes no sound at all. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the November dawn was arriving over the Wyoming prairie in the particular way of late autumn dawns in that country, slowly and without enthusiasm. Gray light spreading across a landscape that offered it nothing to illuminate except grass and distance and the occasional dark shape of a fence line. I'll come down tonight, he said. She poured him more coffee. Yes, she said. You will. What happened over the following weeks was not a conversion exactly. Conversions are sudden. What Arvid experienced was something slower and more durable, which was the accumulation of evidence night after night that the thing Sigrid had built was doing precisely what she had said it would do. The reading on the wall held steady, the tunnel stayed dry, the ventilation moved air gently and continuously without creating draft. The chamber did not flood, did not collapse, did not fill with the groundwater that Thaddeus Breck had predicted with such confidence. They settled into a winter routine. Days were spent in the cabin above ground where a modest fire kept temperatures manageable for cooking and daily work. As evening fell and the surface cold deepened, they descended through the tunnel to the underground chamber. The transition took less than a minute. The difference between the worlds on either side of that transition was some nights 60 degrees. By late November, Garrett Wycliffe had noticed the Halverson woodpile. He noticed it because he rode past the Halverson property every few days on his regular fence inspection circuit, and over the course of 5 years, he had developed an involuntary habit of assessing his neighbor's winter readiness in the same way he assessed his own, the woodpile being the most visible indicator. A short woodpile in November meant a desperate family by February. Wycliffe had seen that trajectory play out twice in his 18 years in Johnson County, and it was not something a person forgot. The Halverson woodpile was not short. The Halverson woodpile was almost exactly the same size it had been in October, which meant that in 6 weeks of November cold, the Halversons had burned almost nothing. He mentioned this to no one, but he rode past the property more often. On the morning of December 12th, after a night during which the surface temperature had dropped to 8 degrees, Wycliffe rode past the Halverson property at 6 in the morning and saw Sigrid emerge from the cabin, cross to the woodpile, take 2 pieces of firewood and go back inside. 2 pieces of wood for breakfast cooking, not 2 pieces to replace what had burned through the night. 2 pieces to start the morning fire for coffee and porridge. He pulled his horse to a stop on the rise above the property and sat there for a full 2 minutes, looking at the unchanged woodpile and the cabin chimney that was only now beginning to produce smoke in the frozen ground that lay between them and whatever was underneath it. Then he did something that cost him more than he would ever admit to anyone, including his wife. He dismounted, tied his horse to the fence post, walked across the frozen yard to the tunnel entrance on the north side of the cabin, and went in. The tunnel was tight, 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, requiring him to bend at the waist and move carefully. The floor sloped downward at a gentle angle, and as he moved through it, the temperature changed not dramatically, Not all at once, but in the same smooth progression that Sigrid had felt descending into the Finnish mine 40 years before the surface cold, giving way to something steadier, something that had its own agenda entirely separate from the weather above. He emerged into the chamber. It was empty. The Halversons were in the cabin above, but the chamber itself was present and complete, and the thermometer on the wall showed 53 degrees, and Garrett Whitcliffe stood in the underground room that a Finnish woman had dug while her husband was sick in bed, and he placed his hand flat against the timber wall, and he felt what was there, which was steadiness, patient, and completely indifferent to the 8 degrees outside. He was there for perhaps 10 minutes. He left without taking anything or moving anything, went back through the tunnel, remounted his horse, and rode away. 2 weeks later, Sigrid found the footprints. After a night of fresh snow, the yard around the cabin and the tunnel entrance showed tracks clearly. There were boot prints at the tunnel entrance that were not Arvid's. The tread was different and not hers, and they had been partially filled by a light snowfall sometime before dawn, which meant they were from the previous afternoon or evening. She did not mention this to Arvid. She wrote the date in her notebook and drew a small mark next to it and said nothing. On December 28th, Garrett Whitcliffe appeared at the cabin door in the mid-morning. He was wearing his good coat, and his expression had the quality of a man who has rehearsed something and is now finding that the rehearsed version is harder to deliver than he anticipated. Sigrid opened the door. "Mrs. Halverson," he said. "Mr. Whitcliffe," she said. A pause. He looked past her into the cabin, which was warm, but not extravagantly so, the fire at a level that maintained comfort without waste. His gaze moved to the woodpile visible through the side window, still not significantly diminished. "I came to see," he started, then stopped. "I was wondering if the chamber—" Another stop. "You already saw it," Sigrid said. The color in Whitecliffe's face changed slightly. "December 12th, he said. "I should have asked." "Yes," she said. "You should have, but you were not ready to ask yet." She stepped back from the door. "Come in, I'll show you properly." He came in. She led him through the root cellar and into the tunnel and down to the chamber, and this time she was there to explain what he was seeing, to show him the thermometer and the ventilation pipe and the drainage sump and the double timber wall with the air gap that provided additional insulation. She showed him the notebook with the Wyoming temperature log, the daily readings going back to September, the surface temperatures swinging between 8 and 62 degrees across 3 months, and the chamber temperature holding in a narrow band between 51 and 54. Wycliffe looked at the numbers for a long time. He was a man who respected data, who kept his own records of rainfall and frost dates and cattle weights, and the data in Sigrid's notebook was impossible to argue with because it was not arguing. It was simply recording what the Earth had been doing quietly and consistently since long before anyone in Johnson County had thought to look. 53 degrees, he said. "Last night the surface was 8 degrees, Sigrid said. The chamber was 53, a 45-degree difference." "Yes." He closed the notebook and handed it back. He looked at the walls, the ceiling, the careful construction that showed in every joint and every decision. "You built this yourself," he said, "while Arvid was sick." "I built this," she said. "Arvid planned the site location. I built it." There was something in how she said it, not with pride exactly, but with the precision of a person who wants the record to be accurate. Wycliffe heard it. He stood in the chamber with 8 degrees of Wyoming winter above his head, and he heard the precision in her voice, and he understood that he was in the presence of something he had completely misjudged. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Yes," Sigrid said. "You do, but wait until January. Then you'll know what you're apologizing for." She did not have to wait long. January arrived in Johnson County the way January arrives in the high plains of northern Wyoming, when it decides to be remembered, not gradually, not with warning, but as a single decisive event that rearranges everything it touches. The first week was cold by normal standards. Temperatures dropping to 15 below at night, the wind coming down from the Bighorn Mountains with the consistency of something mechanical, something that did not tire or vary or take breaks. The second week, the cold intensified. By January 7th, the thermometer outside the Wycliffe Ranch house read 22 below at midnight. On January 8th, the Arctic system arrived. There is no good language for what an Arctic system feels like when it descends onto the high plains of northern Wyoming in the middle of the night. There are numbers which tell part of the story. The temperature at the Halverson cabin at midnight on January 8th was 24 below. By dawn on January 9th, it was 39 below. By the morning of January 10th, the coldest morning in Johnson County in 2 decades, the thermometer outside the Wycliffe Ranch house read 47 below zero. The wind made it worse. Gusts of 30 miles per hour drove the wind chill to numbers that belonged to a different category of experience entirely. Numbers that were not about comfort or discomfort, but about the basic question of whether organic matter could survive in open air. The world contracted. Every person and everything in Johnson County pulled toward warmth and stayed there. At the Wycliffe Ranch, the bunkhouse stove ran continuously for 4 days before the wood supply began to show the strain. Wycliffe's foreman, a man named Aldous, who had been running ranch operations for 12 years and who prided himself on his winter preparation, came to Wycliffe on January 10th with the news that at the current consumption rate, they would exhaust their supply by January 16th, 2 days before the weather forecast suggested the cold might break. They had prepared for a normal bad winter. This was not a normal bad winter. Wycliffe sent 2 men to cut additional wood from the stand of cottonwood along the creek bottom, an emergency measure that, in this particular January cold, was a test of how much a man wanted to be warm. The men came back with what they could carry in 40 minutes, which was less than what one night required, and the older of the 2 men had ice in his beard and could not feel his left foot for an hour after coming inside. At the Breck property, Thaddeus Breck's hired hand, a young man of 23 named Curtis, went out to check the water trough at 7 in the morning on January 10th and did not come back in a reasonable time. Breck went to look for him and found him 40 feet from the door sitting against the fence post with his hands in his lap, not unconscious, but moving in the slow and deliberate way of a person whose body is prioritizing core temperature over peripheral function. Breck got him inside. The young man's fingers on both hands showed the white patches of frostbite. The ring finger on his right hand would carry a scar for the rest of his life. Orville Kemp had no one to find him. He was a homesteader, 44 years old, living alone on a claim 8 miles from Buffalo that he had been working for 3 years with the stubborn incrementalism of a man who believes that persistence is a form of talent. He had prepared adequately for a normal Wyoming winter. He had not prepared for this one. His wood supply was gone by January 11th. He burned his kitchen chairs on January 12th, then the small table, then the wooden box frame of his bed. The neighbors who might have helped him were fighting their own battles with the cold and did not know his supply had run out. On January 13th, Kemp left his cabin on foot, heading for the nearest neighbor 3 miles across the open prairie in 40 below wind. He was found 2 days later on January 15th when the cold had broken enough for people to move. He was half a mile from his destination, the lantern he had carried still in his hand, the flame long dead. Sigrid knew none of the specific details of these events as they were unfolding. She knew the general shape of them because she had watched 5 Wyoming winters, and she understood what 47 below meant for people who were fighting it from above ground with firewood and stoves. She knew the arithmetic of survival in that cold, how fast wood burned, how little it helped, how the stoves glowed red and still the frost formed on interior walls, and men slept in their coats, and the cold simply waited with all the patience of something that had been waiting since before there were people to wait for. She knew all of this from inside a chamber 8 feet below it where the reading on the wall had not moved. On the 3rd day of the cold snap, January 10th, Sigrid climbed to the surface before dawn to check the thermometer and make her daily observation. The cold hit her at the tunnel exit with the force of something solid, something that had mass and intention. She pulled her coat tighter and looked at the thermometer and wrote 47 below in the notebook. And then she turned and looked across the frozen prairie to the southeast toward the direction of Orville Kemp's claim. There was no smoke. On a morning that cold, a cabin with a living fire inside it produced a smoke column that rose straight up in the still air like a signal. Every property she could see from the rise behind her cabin, had a smoke column. The Wycliffe place 1.5 miles to the north. The Breck property 2 miles east. 3 other homesteads she could identify by their positions. From the direction of Kemp's claim there was nothing. Just the flat white of the frozen prairie and the pale sky above it and the absence of smoke that meant either the fire had gone out or the man had gone out with it. She went back inside. Arvid was at the table. She told him what she had seen. He sat with it for a moment, then walked to the south window and looked out as though distance might have changed while she was reporting it. 8 miles, he said. Yes, in this. The temperature outside was 47 below. The wind was gusting to 30 miles per hour. The exposed skin of a person who stepped outside without full protection would begin to freeze within 60 seconds. A person moving across open ground in those conditions, without shelter every half-mile, would not survive the 3-hour walk. Arvid turned from the window. His face had the particular expression of a man confronting a truth he cannot change. "We can't," he said. Sigrid did not respond immediately. She stood at the table and she looked at the south window, and she thought about Orville Kemp and the absence of smoke and the distance of 8 miles and the 47 degrees below zero that stood between doing something and doing nothing. She thought about all of it with the thoroughness of someone who needs to be certain that the conclusion is the right one before she accepts it. Then she went to the coat pegs by the door. She took down the heaviest wool coat, the one she wore for outdoor work in the deepest cold. She reached into the right pocket, the large outer pocket where she kept her work gloves. She took out the gloves. Then she took a piece of paper from the notebook on the shelf, and she wrote on it in her careful hand, "Kemp claim bearing south-southeast, approximately 8 miles from Halverson property. No smoke observed morning of January 10th. She folded the paper and put it in the coat pocket, the right outer pocket where it would be visible immediately to anyone putting on the coat. She hung the coat back on the peg. Arvid watched this without speaking. She turned and looked at him, then looked at the coat on the peg, and he understood what she had done, which was not nothing, and not the impossible thing, but the only thing that was possible, which was to make the information available to anyone who came to them capable of acting on it. No one came. The cold held for 3 more days. On January 15th, when the temperature had risen to 20 below, and the wind had quieted, a rider from the Buffalo direction came past the Halverson property. He stopped at the gate. His name was Perkins, a hand from the Wycliffe Ranch. He was checking the outlying properties, looking in on people who had not been seen in days. Sigrid was outside when he arrived. She went directly to the coat on the peg, took the folded paper from the pocket, and brought it to him. "Kemp's place," she said. "No smoke on the morning of the 10th. We could not reach him." Perkins looked at the paper, then at her. He understood immediately. He rode south. They found Kemp the next morning. Sigrid learned this 3 days later when Thaddeus Breck rode over to report on the state of things. He told her about Kemp with the flat delivery of a man recounting a fact he cannot change. He told her about his hired hand Curtis and the frostbitten fingers. He told her about the wood situation at various properties across the area, the emergency cutting, the furniture burned, the calculations that had come uncomfortably close to the wrong answer. Then he looked at the cabin and the woodpile, which had decreased by perhaps 1/3 since October, which meant the Halversons had burned in 3 months of winter, approximately what a normal homestead burned in 3 weeks. "You slept through all of it," Breck said. "It was not a question." "Every night," Sigrid said. He looked at the ground for a moment. He was a man who had come to her in August to warn her about spring floods and collapsing excavations, who had asked questions he framed as concerns, but were actually skepticism in a practical coat. He looked at the ground now with the expression of a man revising his account of himself. "The boy's fingers will heal," he said finally. "The doctor thinks he'll keep them all." "I'm glad," Sigrid said. "Kemp had no family," Breck said. "No one to know early enough." Sigrid thought of the paper in the coat pocket, of the 3 days it had waited there between when she wrote it and when someone capable of acting on it appeared at her gate. She thought of this without expressing it, because expressing it would not help Curtis's fingers or bring Orville Kemp back, and because she had learned in 38 years that some things needed to be carried quietly and some things needed to be said, and the skill was in knowing which was which. She offered Breck coffee, which he accepted, and they sat at the table in the cabin while the January cold, somewhat reduced from its worst, but still formidable, pressed against the walls outside. "I want to understand how it works," Breck said. "The chamber. Properly understand, not just accept that it does." She got out the notebook. There was a night during the cold snap, the fourth night, when Sigrid lay in the chamber and experienced something she had not anticipated and would think about for the rest of her life. She had experienced the cold of Wyoming for 5 years. She had experienced the particular psychological weight of it, the way it occupied your mind even when you were warm, the calculations running constantly in the background. The fuel supply, the distance to the nearest, help, the margin between adequate and catastrophic. She had experienced waking at 2 in the morning to the sound of the stove dying and the cold moving back in from the walls. She had experienced the exhaustion of a winter that required you to fight every night for the warmth that the next day would demand you replace. None of that was present in the chamber on the fourth night of the worst cold in 20 years. What was present instead was stillness. Not the false stillness of exhaustion, not the temporary stillness of a stove burning well at midnight, but the absolute stillness of a place that the weather could not reach. No wind found the walls. No temperature gradient moved across the ceiling. The thermometer held its reading and had held it every hour of every night since September and would hold it when the spring thaw made the rest of this seem like a bad dream. She lay in the dark in the stillness, and she thought about her father, about the mine in Finland and the large hands and the patience he had for teaching things that mattered, about the chamber he had built and the 3 winters they had spent in it, and the red notebook with the temperature measurements that had never varied by more than 3 degrees, about the winter of 1886 and the camp without a chamber, and the letter that came in February telling her what that absence had cost. She thought about 22 years of carrying the knowledge of what was possible and waiting for the moment when it was possible to build it. She thought about Orville Kemp and the absence of smoke and the paper in the coat pocket and the things that knowledge can and cannot do when it arrives too late for the people who needed it earliest. She did not cry. She lay in the stillness and she understood something fully that she had understood only partially before, which was that the knowledge her father had given her was not just a technical solution to the problem of winter heat. It was a form of inheritance. It was something passed from a person who understood the earth to a person who could carry that understanding forward across an ocean, across 22 years, across 5 Wyoming winters of waiting for the right moment in the right place to dig. The earth had kept its temperature while she waited, patient and unchanged exactly as her father had promised. On the 5th night, with the surface temperature at 41 below, Arvid said something he had not said since July. They were lying in the chamber in the dark, the reading on the wall invisible but present in both their minds, exactly what it had been for every night of the worst cold in 20 years. The silence was complete. The stillness was complete. Everything that was happening above them was happening in a world that had no access to this one. When I was sick, Arvid said, the thing I was most afraid of was not dying. Sigrid waited. I was afraid that the design was wrong, he said, that I had described something I had never actually built, and that you were down in that hole building it, and I did not know with certainty that it would work. He paused. I have worked underground my entire life. I knew the temperature principle, but I had never built a chamber. I had slept in chambers other men built. I did not know if what I described to you was structurally sound. The earth around them held its temperature, unchanged. Were you certain, he asked, when you were building it, were you certain it would work? Sigrid looked at the ceiling she could not see in the dark. The ceiling she had built, beam by beam, over 3 days in early September. The ceiling she had checked and rechecked and tamped and measured. My father built it when I was 16, she said. I measured the temperature every morning and every evening for 3 years. I have been certain since 1883. Arvid was quiet for a long moment. "Since before you knew me," he said. "Yes," she said. "I proposed the idea," he said. It was not a question. It was a man arriving at a complete understanding of something he had only partially understood before. "You did," she said, "and I had the numbers to confirm it. We needed both." Another long silence. Outside, the Wyoming winter was doing what it had been doing for 5 days, which was everything it could, which was not enough. "Why did you not tell me you were certain?" he asked. "It would have helped. When I was lying in that bed wondering if I had sent you into a hole that would collapse or flood or freeze." Sigrid considered this question with the honesty it deserved. "Because being certain and being believed when you say you are certain are different things," she said. "I have known that since I was 12 years old in a Finnish mine. A woman's certainty is treated as stubbornness until it is proven correct. Then it is treated as luck." She paused. "I chose to let the thermometer be certain. Thermometers are not argued with." Arvid said nothing for a while. "Then I argued with the thermometer in my head for 3 months." "I know," she said. "But you stopped." "The numbers stopped me," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is why I kept the numbers." On the morning of January 14th, the cold broke. Not all at once, not with the suddenness of its arrival, but in the gradual way of cold systems that have spent themselves and have nothing left to sustain. The temperature at dawn was 29 below, which after 6 days of 47 was a relative gentleness. By midday, it had climbed to 12 below. By evening, 5 below, with the wind diminished to something that was merely unpleasant rather than lethal. Sigrid emerged from the cabin to split the morning wood, the ordinary domestic cold morning task that had resumed its normal weight after 6 days of extreme. She was standing at the woodblock with the splitting maul when she looked up and saw the figure at the property gate, wrapped in every layer available to him, his horse standing patient and breath-clouded in the cold air behind him. Garrett Wycliffe. He had not sent a hand this time. He had not ridden over as part of his fence inspection circuit with the casual justification of proximity. He was standing at her gate in the first morning after the worst cold in 20 years, with his hat in his hand, the gesture of a man who has thought carefully about what posture is appropriate for the visit he is making. Sigrid set down the maul and walked to the gate. "Mrs. Halverson," he said. His voice had something in it that she had not heard from him before, not in the summer conversations about the excavation, not in December when she had shown him the chamber. Something that had been reduced in him by 6 days of minus 47 degrees, and everything those 6 days had cost. "Mr. Wycliffe," she said. "I burned 8 cords," he said. "In 6 days. 8 cords, and my men still slept in their coats. Aldous lost feeling in 2 toes. He kept them, the doctor thinks, but it was close." Sigrid said nothing. She waited. "You were at 53 degrees, he said, "every night, while we were burning furniture to stay alive." "At 53 degrees, she said, "every night." Wycliffe looked at the property, the cabin, the woodpile that was barely touched compared to his own exhausted reserves. He looked at the ground where the excavation mound showed under a layer of snow, the unobtrusive rise of earth that covered the place where the warmth waited, as it had always waited for someone to come down to it. "My wife," he said. "She wants to understand how it works, and I—" He stopped. "I owe you more than an apology." "Yes," Sigrid said, "but the apology is a start." She opened the gate. "Come inside, I'll get the notebook." He came inside, and this time he came not as a skeptic making a social call, not as a neighbor exercising the authority of experience, but as a man who had been wrong about something important and knew it, and had ridden over in the first reasonable morning after the worst week of his Wyoming life, to say so to the person he had been wrong about. Sigrid put the notebooks on the table. She put the red one, the Finnish one, the one with the temperature measurements from 1880. She put it next to the Wyoming notebook with the 6 days of 47 below and the chamber readings that had not moved. "My father built the first one," she said. I built this one. The principle is the same, has been the same since before either of us was born. She sat down across from him and opened the finished notebook to the first page. This is where it starts, she said. Wycliffe leaned forward. He began to read. Outside, the January cold was retreating across the Wyoming prairie in the slow and reluctant way of things that do not leave easily. The thermometer on the cabin wall was reading 14 below and dropping towards something more manageable toward a winter that would be hard but survivable toward February and then March, and then the spring that came every year to this country, regardless of what winter thought about it. 8 feet below the yard, the earth held what it had always held, patient and constant in the dark below the frost line, in the deep place where warmth was not a victory over cold, but simply the natural condition of things, the baseline from which everything above had departed and to which everything below reliably returned. Sigrid watched Garrett Wycliffe read her father's notebook. She thought of Olavi Virtanen dead in a camp without a chamber in the winter of 1886, his knowledge intact and his body unable to survive long enough for the knowledge to be used. She thought of what it meant to pass something forward, not to sell it, not to keep it, but to pass it forward to everyone who could use it, which was everyone who was cold, which in Johnson County, Wyoming in January of 1903 was everyone. She thought about what came next. There was a great deal of work still to do. The morning after Garrett Wycliffe read the finished notebook, he came back with his wife. Clara Wycliffe was a woman of 48 who had spent 18 years building a life in Johnson County with the particular competence of someone who understood that the frontier did not accommodate incompetence, regardless of gender, and who had developed over those 18 years a precise and unsentimental eye for what worked and what did not. She had watched the Halverson excavation from a distance all summer with more interest than her husband knew. She had listened to his reports of the underground chamber with more attention than she showed. When he came home on the morning of January 15th and told her what he had seen and read in Sigrid Halverson's notebooks, she had one question. When can we go? They arrived together at 10 in the morning, Wycliffe with a notebook he had borrowed the day before, and Clara with the particular alertness of a woman who has been waiting to see something properly for several months. Sigrid met them at the door and led them both through the root cellar and into the tunnel without ceremony. Clara descended the passage with her lantern and emerged into the chamber and stood still for a moment in the way that everyone stood still when they first came into that room after 6 days of 47 below. The stillness was not theatrical. It was the natural response of a nervous system receiving information that contradicted its accumulated experience. She walked to the thermometer. She read it. She turned to Sigrid. "Show me everything," she said. "Not the general idea, everything." Sigrid showed her everything. She showed her the drainage sump and explained the gravel layer and why the site selection mattered before a single shovel of earth was moved. She showed her the double timber wall construction and the air gap that provided additional insulation and the specific joint technique at the corners that prevented the movement she had caught and corrected during construction. She showed her the ventilation pipe and explained the convection principle, the temperature differential that created natural airflow without mechanical assistance, the hood design that prevented precipitation from entering while allowing stale air to exit. She showed her both notebooks, the red finish one from 1880 and the Wyoming one from 1902. She laid them open side by side on the small table in the chamber and let Clara read the temperature columns, the daily measurements spanning 42 months in Finland and 4 months in Wyoming. The numbers that told a story more persuasive than any argument, because they were not an argument at all. They were simply a record of what the earth had been doing quietly and persistently while everything above it made noise. Clara read for 20 minutes. Wycliffe stood to one side and said nothing, which was the right instinct. When Clara finished, she closed both notebooks and placed her hands flat on the table and looked at Sigrid with the expression of a woman reaching a conclusion that has several layers to it. "How many women in this county understand what you've just shown me?" she asked. "One," Sigrid said. "Until this morning." Clara nodded slowly. "That needs to change," she said. This was the beginning of something that Sigrid had been thinking about since August, since the mornings when Thaddeus Breck and Garrett Wickliffe and the other ranchers had come to observe the excavation and had directed their questions and their skepticism at Arvid, who was lying sick in the cabin, rather than at the person standing in the hole with the shovel. She had watched how knowledge moved in Johnson County, who carried it and who received it, and who was trusted to hold it, and she had thought about what her father had told her in the Finnish mine when she was 12 years old. The knowledge belongs to the person who can use it, not to the person who happened to be born into the right circumstances to receive it. In Johnson County in 1903, the people who were most likely to be present when a husband was sick or absent or simply not paying attention were wives. The people who managed fuel supplies and tracked wood consumption and made the midnight calculations about whether the arithmetic of winter survival was going to work out were more often than not the women of the household. The people who woke at 2 in the morning to feed the stove were frequently women. And the people who would be responsible for overseeing construction if a husband was incapacitated as Arvid had been incapacitated were exactly the people who currently knew the least about how underground chambers were built. This was not an accident, it was a system. And Sigrid was not interested in arguing with the system because arguing with systems was slow and exhausting and produced uncertain results. She was interested in routing around the system, which was faster and more reliable, and had the additional advantage of being difficult to object to because it did not announce itself as an objection. She would teach the women, not instead of teaching the men, in addition to, and she would do it in the spaces that the system had already created for women to occupy the after-church conversations, the morning coffee visits, the domestic exchanges that men did not attend and did not particularly notice and did not understand as venues for the transmission of technical knowledge because they had never thought to look. She began with Clara Wickliffe because Clara was already there and already asking the right questions and already possessed of the quality most essential to learning something difficult, which is the willingness to not know something before you know it. Over the following 2 weeks, while Arvid met with Garrett Wickliffe and his foreman in the cabin above to discuss construction planning and timber sourcing and the logistics of spring excavation, Sigrid met with Clara below in the chamber with the notebooks and a piece of flat shale she used as a drawing surface and a stick of charcoal from the fire. She taught drainage first because drainage was the failure mode that would destroy a chamber before it was ever used. And because understanding drainage required understanding how water moved through soil, which was a form of knowledge that transferred to every other aspect of underground construction. She drew cross-sections of the earth layers, the topsoil and the clay and the gravel, and she explained what each layer did and how to identify them from the soil that came up during excavation. She taught soil pressure next because soil pressure was what the shoring resisted, and because the shoring was what stood between a sleeping person and the earth collapsing on them, and because this was the piece of the construction where the margin for error was smallest. She explained the corner joint technique in detail, the diagonal bracing, the way to test for movement before it became catastrophic. She taught ventilation last because ventilation was the piece that most people underestimated, the piece that seemed like a detail but was actually fundamental because a sealed underground chamber was not a sleeping room, but a slow suffocation. She explained the physics in plain terms, the warm air rising, the cool air following the continuous, gentle circulation that kept the chamber habitable without any intervention from the people sleeping in it. Clara took notes, not tentative notes, not the notes of a person trying to be polite about information they are not sure they need. Detailed notes, precise and organized with her own diagrams alongside Sigrid's, with questions written in the margins that she would return to in the next session. "You've taught before," Sigrid said on the third day, watching Clara work through a calculation about timber load. "Sunday school," Clara said without looking up. 12 years. "The principle is the same," Sigrid said. Clara finished her calculation and looked up. "Who taught you?" she asked. "My father," Sigrid said, "in a copper mine in Finland. He thought knowledge belonged to the person who could use it." "Sensible man," Clara said. "He died because he didn't have a chamber in a new camp," Sigrid said. He ran out of winter before he could build one. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at her notes, and then at the chamber walls, and then at the thermometer reading its steady number in the first week of February, while outside the world was still navigating the aftermath of the worst cold in 20 years. Then we should build more of them, she said. It was not a question, it was a statement of purpose delivered with the efficiency of a woman who has identified something that needs doing and is already thinking about how to begin. The first conversation happened 3 weeks later on a Sunday in late February after the service at the Lutheran Church in Buffalo. It was the kind of morning that February in Wyoming occasionally offered as a form of apology for what the month had been clear and cold, but manageable, the sky a hard blue above the white prairie, the kind of morning that made a person believe the spring would actually come. Sigrid and Clara stood with 3 other women in the churchyard after the service, the men having drifted toward the hitching posts and their own conversations about cattle prices and fence repairs and the state of the roads. The women were Margaret Breck Thaddeus's wife, a practical woman of 44, who had spent the cold snap managing her household through a fuel shortage that had come closer to catastrophic than her husband knew. Beside her was Ruth Engstrom, the pastor's wife, who had a methodical quality to her thinking that Sigrid had noticed over 4 years of Sunday morning conversations. And there was a younger woman, Nell Hartley, 29, whose husband ran a small homestead 6 miles north of Buffalo and who had managed the household alone for 3 weeks in January while her husband was laid up with a broken wrist sustained in the first days of the cold snap. These women had not been gathered by announcement or invitation. They had gathered the way women gathered after church by proximity and habit, and the natural clustering of people who had been through something difficult together and needed to talk about it without the particular performance that mixed company required. Sigrid let the conversation find its own way to the cold snap, which did not take long because the cold snap was what everyone in Johnson County was still talking about and would talk about for years. She listened to Margaret describe the fuel situation, the emergency burning of the fence post from the east pasture, the calculations that had occupied every waking hour for 6 days. She listened to Nell describe her husband's injury and the particular challenge of managing everything alone in that cold, the livestock, the fuel, the water, the endless domestic maintenance of survival. Then she said simply, "Come and see the chamber." She did not explain it first. She did not argue for it or sell it or present its merits. She said, "Come and see it," the way her father had said, "Come down with me," in the Finnish mine 40 years before, the way he had guided her hand against the rock wall and let the temperature speak before he offered a single word of explanation. They came the following Tuesday, all 4 of them, Clara included, as a woman who had already seen it and could answer questions Sigrid could not anticipate. They descended through the tunnel in a line lanterns lit and emerged into the chamber and experienced the same stillness and the same steady temperature that had greeted everyone who had come before them. Sigrid showed them the notebooks. She showed them the drainage and the shoring and the ventilation. She answered their questions with the notebooks open on the table and the thermometer visible on the wall and the evidence of the construction surrounding them on every side. She showed them the things she had built while her husband was in bed sick, the joints she had corrected, the mistakes she had caught before they became disasters. She told them about the 3 winters of measurements in Finland and the red notebook and what her father had understood about the earth and had passed to her. She did not tell them it was easy. She told them it was learnable. There was a difference. Margaret Breck asked how long the excavation took. Sigrid told her week by week from the pilot hole to the finished ceiling. Margaret calculated in her head. Thaddeus could do the rough digging, she said, but the shoring, the corners especially, could a woman do that without the mine background? I had mine background, Sigrid said, but the technique is not complicated. It requires care more than experience. I can teach the technique in an afternoon. Ruth Engstrom asked about ventilation failure. What happened if the pipe blocked? Sigrid explained the backup, the tunnel itself, providing a secondary airflow path, the design redundancy her father had built into the original and she had replicated. Ruth wrote this down in a small notebook she had brought. Nell Hartley asked nothing during the visit. She stood near the thermometer for most of it, her hand resting on the wall beside it, feeling the steady cool, while her eyes moved across the construction with an attention that Sigrid recognized as the attention of a person already planning. When they emerged from the tunnel and stood in the February cold, Nell Hartley turned to Sigrid and said, "My husband's wrist will heal by May. The ground will be workable by April. Show me the site selection process." By the end of March, Sigrid had met with 11 women from across Johnson County in groups of 2 or 3, always in the chamber, always with the notebooks, always starting with the temperature evidence before moving to the construction details. She met with them after church during midweek visits, framed as ordinary social calls on Saturday mornings when the men were occupied with the livestock and the fence work that accumulated through winter into spring urgency. She was not secretive about this. She was simply operating in the spaces that existed, the spaces that had always existed that the system had created for women and then forgotten to monitor because it had not occurred to anyone that technical knowledge might travel through them. Meanwhile, above ground and in the cabin and at the general store and at the ranch houses where men gathered to plan their spring construction, a parallel process was underway. Garrett Wycliffe had committed to building a chamber at the ranch before the frost had fully left the ground. He met with Arvid twice in February, then 3 times in March, going over the site selection criteria and the construction sequence. He brought his foreman Aldous, who brought a focused personal interest to the technical details that came from having nearly lost something irreplaceable to the cold. Thaddeus Breck began his excavation in early April. He hired 2 additional hands to speed the digging, motivated by the memory of Curtis's frostbitten fingers and the fence posts he had burned in January. His wife Margaret had by this point 3 sessions with Sigrid in the underground chamber and a notebook of her own containing diagrams and calculations and the corner joint technique described in enough detail to teach it to someone else. When Breck's excavation reached the shoring stage and the corners presented themselves as the precise challenge Sigrid had described, it was Margaret who walked him through the technique. Not because Breck was incapable of learning it from Arvid, but because Margaret was there and knew it, and the corner needed doing that afternoon, and waiting for the next meeting with Arvid would have cost a day. Breck said nothing about this afterward except to Aldous, and what he said to Aldous was, "She knew the joint better than I did." Aldous, who had been thinking about his toes since January, said, "Then she should teach it." By the end of May 1903, 5 underground sleeping chambers were under construction across Johnson County. In 3 of the 5, the person who had overseen the shoring stage, the critical technical element that determined whether the chamber would stand or collapse, was a woman who had learned the technique from Sigrid Halvorsen in an underground room in the first weeks of February, while the men were talking about timber sources in the cabin above. The Buffalo Bulletin ran a story in August 1903. It was a modest piece, 3 columns on the inside page, describing the Finnish method of underground sleeping as pioneered by Arvid Halvorsen of Johnson County following the catastrophic cold of the previous January. The article quoted Arvid. It mentioned his Finnish mining background. It described the construction principles in general terms and noted that 5 additional chambers were now complete or under construction in the county. It did not mention Sigrid. Sigrid read the article at the kitchen table on the morning it appeared. She read it twice carefully, the way she read everything. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer with the red notebook and the letter about her father and the other documents. She kept the record of what had happened and who had been part of it. Arvid watched her do this. He had read the article before she came downstairs. He knew what it contained and what it did not. "I'll write a correction," he said. "No," Sigrid said. "Not yet." He looked at her. Then when? She thought about the 11 women who had visited the chamber in February and March, about the 3 construction sites where women had overseen the critical shoring work, about the knowledge that was now moving through Johnson County in a form that did not require a newspaper article to validate it, a form that would persist regardless of what the newspaper said or did not say, because it was encoded in the hands and the notebooks of women who would use it and teach it and pass it forward. She thought about what her father had said. Knowledge belongs to the person who can use it, not to the person who happened to be born into the right circumstances to receive it. The knowledge is moving, she said. That is what matters right now. Letters began arriving in September. The Buffalo Bulletin article had been picked up by an agricultural journal published in Cheyenne, which had summarized it and circulated it to its subscriber list, which included farmers and ranchers in Montana, the Dakotas, Nebraska, and as far east as Minnesota. The letters came addressed to Arvid Halverson, Johnson County, Wyoming, and they came with the desperate specificity of people who had endured something last winter that they were determined not to endure again. A farmer in Montana who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite in February wanted to know the exact depth required. A rancher in North Dakota wanted the ventilation pipe dimensions and the hood design. A homesteader in Nebraska asked about clay soil and whether the drainage technique would work in ground that held water. A woman in Minnesota who signed her letter simply as E. Linkfist asked for the corner joint technique in enough detail to teach it to her husband, who would be doing the shoring himself. Sigrid answered every letter. She wrote in English, which she had been learning since 1898, with the same methodical patience she brought to everything. And in her careful English, she described the site selection and the pilot hole drainage test, and the soil composition requirements, and the timber dimensions, and the shoring sequence, and the corner joint, and the ventilation pipe, and the hood design and the drainage sump. She drew diagrams on separate sheets, cross-sections, and plan views and detailed drawings of the critical joints, and she folded them into the envelopes with the letters. She signed them with Arvid's name. She did this not with resentment and not with resignation, but with the clear-eyed practicality of a woman who understood that the letter signed by Arvid Halverson would be read and acted upon, and the letter signed by Sigrid Halverson would be read with a fraction less certainty and acted upon with a fraction more hesitation, and in the matter of winter survival fractions were not trivial. Arvid knew. He read each letter before it was sealed, and he signed his name at the bottom of each one, and he did not pretend that the words above his signature were his words, because he and Sigrid were past the point of pretending about things that were clearly true. He signed 83 letters in the autumn and winter of 1903. He signed 41 more in 1904. In 1905, the volume decreased as the knowledge began to replicate itself as the people who had built chambers wrote their own letters to their own neighbors, and the network grew in ways that no longer required the Halverson address as its origin point. The knowledge was moving in the form of letters with Arvid's name on them, and in the form of notebooks carried in women's pockets, and in the form of corner joint techniques passed between people at church, and in the form of conversations that happened in underground chambers where the thermometer read its steady number, and the evidence was present and undeniable on every wall. In 1907, the Johnson County Agricultural Office invited Arvid Halverson to present his underground chamber system at the county fair. He stood before 40 ranchers and homesteaders and described the construction sequence and answered questions for an hour. Sigrid sat in the third row and said nothing. Afterward, 4 women came to her specifically having been told by Clara Wycliffe and Margaret Breck that Sigrid was the person to speak to if you wanted the technical details rather than the general description. She met with them the following week, in the chamber, with the notebooks. By 1910, underground sleeping chambers had spread beyond Johnson County into the neighboring counties of Sheridan, Campbell, and Weston. Agricultural journals published articles. Letters continued to arrive now from Idaho and Colorado, and occasionally from states further east where the winters, while not Wyoming severe, were severe enough to make the arithmetic of firewood a constant anxiety. The Wyoming State Agricultural Extension Service sent a letter in the spring of 1912 inviting Arvid Halverson to address their annual meeting in Cheyenne. The meeting would include 200 ranchers and agricultural producers from across the state. The subject would be winter survival techniques with particular attention to the underground chamber system that had been spreading through Wyoming's northern counties for the previous 9 years. Arvid showed Sigrid the letter at breakfast. She read it carefully. She set it down on the table. She looked at the kitchen wall where the thermometer from the original chamber now hung, relocated to the cabin 2 winters ago, when they had built a second larger chamber and retired the first to ceremonial status. The thermometer read 58 degrees because it was April and the surface was warming, but the chamber temperature it had recorded for 9 winters never moved more than 3 degrees from 53. "You should go," she said. "We should go," he said. "They invited you," she said. "Because they don't know to invite you," he said. "That is not the same thing as you not being the person who should speak." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the April Wyoming morning was doing what April mornings in Wyoming did, offering a tentative warmth that had not yet committed to staying. "Write the speech," Arvid said. "Write what you would say if you were standing at that podium in front of 200 men who need to understand what you understand. Write it completely. Every word." She looked at him. And then I'll read it," he said. "Every word, without changing anything." She considered this for a long time. It was not a perfect solution. She was aware it was not a perfect solution. She was aware that a perfect solution would involve her standing at the podium herself, speaking in her own voice to 200 people who needed what she knew, and that a perfect solution was not available in Cheyenne, Wyoming in 1912. What was available was this: a room full of people who needed the knowledge, a husband willing to carry her words into that room without altering them, a thermometer that had been holding its number for 9 years and would go on holding it long after both of them were gone, a red notebook from Finland and a Wyoming notebook beside it, and 83 letters sent under someone else's name that had built chambers across the northern plains that were keeping people alive. The knowledge was moving. That was what mattered. She began writing that evening. She wrote at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp burning, and Arvid reading at the other end of the table, and the April cold settling over the Wyoming prairie outside, with less authority than it had possessed in January, with the particular diminished cold of a season that knows it is losing. She wrote in English, which she now commanded with the precision of a person who had been learning it for 14 years, with the specific goal of being understood clearly and completely. She wrote about the earth and what it knew. She wrote about depth and temperature and the physics of thermal mass in plain language that a rancher who had never thought about physics would understand immediately, because she had been explaining these things to ranchers for 9 years, and she knew which words worked and which ones lost people. She wrote about her father, not the Finnish mind and the technical details, but Olavi Virtanen, the man, the teacher, the person who had believed that knowledge belonged to the person who could use it, and who had acted on that belief by taking his 12-year-old daughter underground and pressing her hand against the rock. She wrote about the winter of 1886 and what the absence of a chamber had cost. Not to create sympathy, but to make the stakes concrete, because abstract stakes did not move people to action, and she was not writing to be admired. She was writing to be useful. She wrote about Johnson County in January 1903, the 47 degrees below zero, and the 6 days of it, and what it had cost the county in fuel and frostbite, and in the case of Orville Kemp, something that could not be recovered. She wrote about the chamber reading 53 degrees through all of it, not as a triumph, but as a fact, the same kind of fact as the temperature in her father's finished notebook, a fact that had been true before anyone wrote it down and would go on being true after the paper was gone. She wrote about what needed to be done, the site selection and the construction sequence, and the critical importance of the corner joints and the ventilation. She wrote it in enough detail that a man who read it carefully and asked the right questions could go home and begin planning. She wrote the questions she expected them to ask, and she answered them before they were asked, because she had been answering versions of those questions for 9 years. She wrote the last paragraph at 11 o'clock, by which time Arvid had stopped reading and was watching her from across the table with the expression he had worn on the evening in 1901, when she had put the red notebook in front of him, and he had understood for the first time the full measure of what she had been carrying. She set down the pen. She read through what she had written. She made 3 small corrections, a word changed here, a sentence tightened there, the adjustments of a person who takes precision seriously. Then she slid the pages across the table to Arvid. He read them without speaking. He turned the pages slowly reading in the careful way he had of reading things that mattered, the way he had read the finished notebook 11 years ago. When he finished the last page, he held it for a moment without putting it down. "Not one word changed," he said. "Not one word," she said. He nodded. He stacked the pages carefully and set them beside his own place at the table. "Go to bed," he said. "I want to read it again." Cheyenne, Wyoming, October 14th, 1912. The Wyoming State Agricultural Extension annual meeting was held in the largest room available in the state capitol, a hall that seated 220 people and that had been built for occasions of civic importance, and that smelled as such rooms always smell, of wood polish and old paper, and the collective seriousness of people who have come to learn something they need. The 200 ranchers and agricultural producers who filled the seats that morning had come from across Wyoming, from the northern counties and the Central Plains and the high desert of the Southwest, from places that shared the common condition of being very cold in winter and very far from the resources that made cold manageable. They were mostly men in their middle years, with the rancher's face and the rancher's hands and the rancher's specific form of attention, which was not the attention of people who were interested in ideas in the abstract, but the attention of people who were calculating constantly and automatically whether an idea had practical application to the particular conditions of their particular lives. Sigrid sat in the fourth row. She had debated whether to come. The speech was Arvid's to deliver, or rather it was hers to deliver through Arvid, and her presence in the audience added nothing to the words on the pages in his coat pocket. But she had written every word of what would be said in this room, and she had been present in one form or another at every stage of the 9 years that had led to this moment, and she found in the end that she wanted to be in the room when the words were spoken, even if she was not the one speaking them. Arvid was introduced by the extension director as the originator of the Finnish underground chamber system, pioneer of earth-sheltered sleeping in Wyoming, whose methods had spread to 4 counties and were responsible for a measurable reduction in winter fuel consumption across the northern plains. The director said these things with the confidence of someone reading from prepared notes, and they were accurate as far as they went. Arvid stood at the podium. He was 51 years old, still lean from the mining years, with the unhurried quality of a man who had learned patience from the earth itself. He took the pages from his coat pocket and laid them on the podium and looked out at the 200 faces looking back at him. He looked at Sigrid in the fourth row. She gave him no signal. She did not nod or gesture or change her expression in any visible way. She simply looked at him with the steady attention of a person who is waiting for something to begin. He looked down at the first page. He read. He read about the earth and what it knew in the plain and precise language she had written. The language that moved from simple fact to physical principle to practical application without a wasted word. He read about thermal mass and depth and the difference between the chaos of the seasons and the patience of the ground. He read about site selection and drainage and the soil composition requirements and the pilot hole test. He read about the shoring sequence and the corner joints and the ventilation principle. He read the questions the audience would have and the answers to those questions delivered in the order that a person who had been explaining this for 9 years knew was most effective. He read about Olavi Virtanen, about the Finnish mine and the large hands, and what it meant to believe that knowledge belonged to the person who could use it. About the chamber built in 1880, and the 3 winters of temperature measurements, and the red notebook with the numbers that never varied by more than 3 degrees. He read about the winter of 1886 and the camp without a chamber, and what the absence of preparation had cost. He read about Johnson County in January 1903, about 47 degrees below zero and 6 days of it, and the wood that burned and the frostbite, and the person who had been found half a mile from help with a dead lantern in his hand. He read about the chamber holding 53 degrees through all of it. The room was quiet in a particular way, the way that rooms are quiet when 200 people are listening to something that connects directly to their own experience, when the words on the podium are not describing an abstract possibility, but a specific solution to a problem every person in the room had spent winters fighting without winning. He reached the last paragraph. He read it in her voice, which had become clear enough in 9 years that he could hear it even when he was speaking. He read about what needed to be done, the construction details, the spring planning, the letters he would answer, and the diagrams he would provide. He read the final sentence, which was about the earth and its patience and the permanent nature of what it offered and the simplicity of accepting what had always been available. He stopped. He stood at the podium for a moment in the particular silence that follows the end of something that has been listened to carefully. He looked at the pages in front of him. Then he looked at the 200 faces. Then he looked at Sigrid in the fourth row. He folded the pages and put them in his coat pocket, the same pocket they had come from. He put both hands on the podium and he looked at the room, and he said in his own voice now, not reading, speaking, "Those are not my words. Every word I read to you this morning was written by my wife Sigrid Halvorsen, who is sitting in the fourth row. She is the person who grew up in Finnish copper mines and learned what the earth knows from her father. She is the person who built our first chamber while I was sick in bed. She has spent 9 years teaching this method to the ranchers and the wives of ranchers of Johnson County and answering letters from Montana and the Dakotas and Nebraska and places further east. Every diagram I have ever sent, she drew. Every letter I have ever signed, she wrote." He paused. The room was very quiet. "I am the name on the letters," he said. "She is the knowledge in them. I thought you should know the difference." The silence held for a moment longer. The silence of 200 people absorbing something that did not fit cleanly into the categories they had brought into the room that morning. Then a man in the front row stood up. He was a rancher from Sheridan County, 60 years old, with a face that had been made by 4 decades of Wyoming weather, and he stood and he put his hands together. Then the man beside him stood. Then 3 more in the second row. Then it moved back through the room in the way that such things move not all at once but in a wave. The standing spreading row by row until most of the room was on its feet, and the sound in the hall was the sound of 200 men acknowledging something that should have been acknowledged 9 years earlier, and was being acknowledged now imperfectly and belatedly, and in the only way available, which was the way that was actually possible. Sigrid sat in the fourth row and watched this happen. She did not stand. She did not gesture or wave or otherwise perform the moment that Arvid had made for her. She sat with her hands in her lap and she looked at the 200 men on their feet in the hall, and she felt for the first time in a long time the particular weight of something being set down. Not the knowledge. The knowledge had never been a burden. The knowledge was the thing that had kept her moving through 4 Wyoming winters, and 1 summer in a hole in the ground, and 9 years of letters signed with someone else's name. The knowledge was the inheritance her father had given her, and she had carried forward, and it was lighter than it looked because it was the kind of thing that gets lighter as it spreads, not heavier. What she set down was the waiting. The 22 years of knowing something and not being asked. The patience that was not patience by choice, but patience by necessity. The particular endurance of a person who has the answer and is not in the room where answers are received. She had carried that without complaint because complaint was not useful, and she was above everything a practical woman. But it had weight. She had not known how much weight until this moment when 200 Wyoming ranchers stood up in a hall in Cheyenne, and the weight was simply gone. She thought of her father, not of the mine or the notebooks or the winter of 1886. Just of the man himself, the large hands and the quiet face, and the absolute conviction that knowledge belonged to the person who could use it. She thought of what he would have made of this room, this moment, this particular form of acknowledgement arriving 9 years late in the only way it could arrive. He would have said it was enough. He was a practical man, too. After the session wherein the ranchers had filed out into the October Cheyenne afternoon, and the extension director was gathering his papers, and Arvid was at the front of the room answering the questions of the men who had crowded toward the podium, a woman approached Sigrid. She was perhaps 45, with the look of a rancher's wife from the high country, a woman who had built something with her hands and intended to go on building. She sat down in the empty seat beside Sigrid without asking permission, which was a form of directness Sigrid respected. The corner joint technique, the woman said. The diagonal brace. Can you show me the dimensions? Sigrid opened her coat and took out the notebook she carried everywhere. The current one, the successor to the Wyoming notebook that had succeeded the Finnish notebook, the latest volume in a record that had been running since 1880. She opened it to a blank page and picked up the pencil she kept in the spine. She drew the corner joint, the vertical post, the horizontal planking, the diagonal brace at 45 degrees, the specific fastening points that resisted the lateral pressure of the soil. She drew it in the precise and practiced way of a person who has drawn it many times for many people in many different underground rooms across the northern plains of the United States. She handed the notebook to the woman who studied the drawing for a moment and then looked up. Can I copy this? You can keep the page, Sigrid said. She tore it out cleanly along the binding and held it out. The woman took it. She folded it carefully and put it in her own coat pocket. Thank you, she said. Build it right, Sigrid said. The corner is where people make mistakes. Take your time with the corner. The woman nodded and left. Sigrid watched her go, then turned back to the notebook and dated the page where the drawing had been and wrote corner joint diagram provided to Rancher Cheyenne. October 14th, 1912, and the name of the county the woman had mentioned, which was Carbon County, which was in the southern part of Wyoming, which meant the knowledge had now been carried to a part of the state it had not previously reached. She closed the notebook and put it back in her coat. Arvid Halverson lived until 1937. He died on a February morning in the cabin above the chambers, the first one and the larger second one built in 1910, in the particular way of old miners, quietly and without much apparent objection. He was 76 years old. The last winter of his life was cold but not severe. Nothing like 1903, and he spent the deepest nights of it underground, in the same warmth he had been sleeping in for 35 years, without fire, without waking in the ancient steadiness that the earth had been keeping since long before there were people in Wyoming to make use of it. Sigrid Halverson lived until 1943. She was 79 years old when she died, and she had spent 35 winters descending into the chamber that she had built alone in the summer of 1902. And the thermometer in that chamber had read 53 degrees. On the last night she slept in it, exactly as it had read 53 degrees on the first night, because that is what the earth does. That is the only thing the earth has ever done in this story. It holds its temperature. It keeps its promise. It waits for someone to come deep enough to find it. Her daughter, cleaning the house in the weeks after Sigrid died, found the drawer in the bedroom where Sigrid had kept the documents. The red Finnish notebook from 1880, its cover soft with age, the temperature measurements inside still legible in the careful columns her grandfather had begun and her mother had continued. The Wyoming notebook, the original one from 1902, its pages dense with 9 years of daily measurements. A letter in Finnish, the one that had come in February 1886, announcing the death of Olavi Virtanen in a camp without a chamber. A newspaper clipping from the Buffalo Bulletin, August 1903. The article about the Finnish method that had mentioned Arvid's name and not Sigrid's, folded and preserved without annotation. And a third notebook smaller that the daughter had not seen before. She opened it. Inside were temperature measurements, daily readings morning and evening from September 1902 to February 1937. 35 years of numbers in Sigrid's careful hand, recording what the chamber had done every single day of those 35 years. The surface temperatures appeared in the left column, swinging between summer heat and winter cold in the enormous range of Wyoming weather. The chamber temperatures appeared in the right column, moving in their narrow band between 51 and 55 degrees across 3.5 decades. The daughter turned pages, the numbers ran on, day after day, winter and summer and winter again, the surface world doing what the surface world does, and the underground world doing what it has always done, which is nothing, which is holding, which is being exactly what it has been since before the measurement began, and continuing to be exactly that after the measurement ends. At the bottom of the last page of the last entry, dated February 1937, the month of Arvid's death, Sigrid had written in English, in the precise and practiced hand of a woman who had been writing in her second language for nearly 40 years. Father was right. The earth remembers. There is one more thing in the drawer that Sigrid's daughter found. Not a notebook, not a letter. A single page folded once in Sigrid's handwriting, undated, written in Finnish, the language she had not written in since the letter from her father arrived in 1886. Her daughter, who had grown up speaking English on the Wyoming prairie, could not read it. She brought it to Pastor Engstrom's widow, who was 81 years old, and still read Finnish with the ease of a woman who had grown up with it. The old woman unfolded the page and read it, and she was quiet for a moment before she translated. It said, "I did not dig a hole. I dug a door. On one side is the cold that takes everything. On the other side is the warmth that was always there. I only learned where to look. My father showed me. I showed everyone I could find. That is all any of us can do. Find the door, go through it, then turn around and hold it open." The page is preserved with the notebooks in the Historical Society's collection. The handwriting is exact and unhurried, the handwriting of a woman who knew what she wanted to say and took the time to say it correctly. The chamber still exists. The Historical Society that now maintains the Halverson property keeps it intact. The timber walls still sound after more than a century underground. The ventilation pipes still open to the sky above the drainage, still doing what the gravel layer below the clay has always done. Visitors descend the tunnel the way Wycliffe descended it in December 1902, bending at the waist, moving through the temperature gradient, emerging into the room. The thermometer on the wall reads 53 degrees. It read 53 degrees in January 1903 when the surface was 47 below zero. It read 53 degrees in August when the surface baked at 90. It reads 53 degrees today, and it will read 53 degrees tomorrow, and it will go on reading 53 degrees long after every person who has ever visited the chamber or read about it or built one like it in the frozen ground of the northern plains has returned to the same earth that kept its temperature for them. The cold above is temporary. The warmth below is permanent. Sigrid Halverson knew this when she was 16 years old, standing in a Finnish mine with her father's large hand pressing her palm against the rock. She carried it across an ocean. She carried it through 4 years of Wyoming winters, burning through firewood and losing sleep. She carried it through the summer she spent alone in a hole in the ground while her husband was sick in bed, and her neighbors rode over to observe the spectacle of a woman with a shovel. She carried it through 6 days of 47 below zero, sleeping in 53 degrees, while the world above exhausted itself, fighting a cold it could not win against. She carried it through 35 years of teaching it to anyone who would listen in underground rooms, with charcoal diagrams and notebooks full of numbers and letters signed with someone else's name in the specific and patient transmission of knowledge from the person who had it to the people who needed it. She carried it to the end, the door still open.